I think most of my childhood and, you know, until late high school, my dream was to be an architect. I mean, once I got past the, little kid where you want to be an astronaut or a
Right.
fireman, and my dad was a fireman. But yeah, I was really drawn toward. I mean, even as maybe even grade school, like a passion for designing buildings. I had no idea how to do it. I would sit down and try to design something and had no idea what to do
Right.
that age, but that's really what I wanted to do. So the idea of like designing buildings and spaces um, really fascinated me, and the drawings, the technical drawings, the blueprints, like all of that, that was really cool. So I used to do these little drawings. I did a couple of them for my grandmother who worked in the arts. I think they were on 3x5 note cards. And I think they were, it was blueprints from, it was either Star Wars or Star Trek. I had both. There were like, they'd come out with these blueprints. They were like blue line prints, or what looked, or a version, like a mass produced version of a blue line print,
Mhm.
um, of Star Trek, like floor plans of like the Enterprise and different things. And then there was a similar thing with Star Wars. There was like, and they came in a little packet and they folded out. I think a lot of them were actually probably drawings that the art departments had done of different
Mhm.
pieces of sets and spaceships and things. Um, and I love those movies. I love Star Wars. I love Star Trek, and but even the little like the title blocks and everything, I just thought all that was cool, and the way things were dimensioned. So I did these little drawings that were just, I was trying to emulate that on a 3x5 note card of just like, I did something and it was titled Circle Dimensions, and it was like circles with different,
Mhm.
dimensions on it. And then I did a little title block, and it was all very messy and, I guess very cute. At the time, it drove me nuts that it was not near, it wasn't super clean and professional, but, looking back, it's very cute. Um, and that's really what I wanted to do. And then I got into high school, late high school. I was taking a number of science classes that I was really into. And so when I started college, I decided I wasn't was not going to go into architecture. I wanted to go into medicine. I was in pre-med. I wanted to become a surgeon. And but with I think my minor, so it was pre-med, then you declare a minor, as I remember it. And I was doing biological and pre-medical illustration is what it was called. So it was still like an artistic bent. But I got to college, and as much as I loved my science classes and advanced science classes in high school, when I got to college, I didn't like the classes at all. So I very quickly, within the first semester, I was like, okay, I'm not passionate about this, and didn't know what to do. And was a little afraid to break the news to my parents. And my mother said, well, what about architecture? That's what you were always, passionate about. And I said, well, yeah, that makes sense. And went into that. There was an architecture program. Enrolled at Iowa State. I grew up in Des Moines, Iowa. So, and there's an architecture, it's a department of architecture, at least at the time, part of the College of Design.
Mhm.
So I was able to quickly just transition into that and just fell in love with it again, and at a new level. And that's really what I wanted to do. And I finished at Iowa State. I went to grad school in Los Angeles at the Southern California Institute of Architecture. I had been lucky enough to arrange a job before grad school with Richard Meyer and partners on the Getty Museum project, which was in its really early phases. And then while I was in grad school, I worked for Frank Gehry. So I worked for two really big architects, and I'd worked for kind of, one of the biggest firms in Des Moines before heading out to LA. So I was very passionate about it. And then the economy hit a recession, and I started working. There were like, I mean, even with my pedigree and those work experiences under my belt, there were really no jobs. I ended up taking a job reluctantly working in theme park design. And as much as I didn't enjoy the work at all, like seemed as serious as architecture is, the theme park stuff seemed very playful and silly. And I I wasn't passionate about it. It paid way more than I would have made in architecture. So I felt like I'd sold myself out really quickly, which I didn't like. And I always thought, I'll go back to architecture. I'll go back. So working in theme parks, and there were people that did that's what they did, and they were brilliant at it. And I felt like I think a lot of it I was just drafting for them, and I think my drawings looked quite good, but I think I never quite got it. It was but there were a number of people that worked in that field that were doing what I did. I think a lot of us were titled set designers, and a lot of those people were actually set designers in film and TV. And at some point, and I ended up working for 2 or 3 or 4 different theme park design companies over the span of, I don't know, 2, 3, 4 years. Someone I was working with knew about an opening on a soap opera that's not around anymore, called Santa Barbara. Mm-hmm. And they were looking for an assistant art director. So I went and interviewed for that. I ended up getting the job. So that was my first TV job. And that's what I really cut my teeth on. And I didn't know what I was doing, but that's one of those jobs that in the TV business, like it doesn't pay as much as if you were working on like all those union jobs, there's a pay structure, and that was like one of the lower ones. So I think that's why they were willing to consider me with no experience, no TV experience. So I did that for, I think, about a year and a half, and I learned a lot. And it's one of those things, like, you start learning about it and you realize the more you learn, the more you realize how little you know, and I did that for about a year and a half. And that was one of those shows that was always on the cusp of getting canceled. So I was like, I need to find something else. I ended up leaving that show after 18 months or so, working for a designer named Bob Keane, who his bread and butter was doing award shows. He did almost every award show you can think of at the time. And he had a busy season and a slow season. So he's heading into the busy season. He hired me. And again, this was something where I was not making a lot of money working there. And I think that's one of the reasons he was willing to hire me. And what working there did was, I think I added maybe 13 shows to my resume in like 6 or 7 months. So I went from having like tiny resume in TV to filling a page. Sure. And learned a lot there. He was very difficult to work for, but I learned a lot. And right after that, so then he went into a slow season. I was looking for work, and I ended up getting hired onto a movie called The Road to Wellville, which was my first movie, and that was shooting in Wilmington, North Carolina. So I think my title in that was draftsman, and it was like the English spelling, like Drotsman. If you look at the credits, like Drotsman. It's like very cool. So that was an amazing experience. That was a very nicely designed movie. Production designer, a guy named Brian Morris. Art director, a Canadian guy, John Willett. And that was just really an amazing experience. Like, just nicely designed movie. And we worked our tails off. I think we worked 6 days a week, probably 14 hours a day. And again, I think I was working non-union at the time. But that led to other opportunities. So then I spent the next probably 10 years working as like an assistant art director. I'd moved maybe shortly after that, moved to New York, and the union structure is a little different from New York to LA. So whereas in LA there was a set designer category, actually was a separate union at the time. And set designers drafted the sets, and assistant art directors. I think the division of what those positions do is still the same, but now it's all part of the same union. But in New York, there's no set designer category. It's all assistant art directors. So I worked for probably 10 years or so as an assistant art director based out of New York. Worked a lot in New York and got sent on the road number of times for movies. And basically my career over time, I worked my way up the ladder. So I spent a lot of time working in a position and honing my skills and learning. And then I had an opportunity. It was a pilot for a show called Third Watch. It was an NBC show, John Wells production, back when John Wells was, I think, ER was on the air and West Wing. So this was like the next John Wells show. And this was when network was king. And it was like, this was going to be the next big thing. And they were looking for an art director for the pilot. It was a show that was already picked up for the series, which was weird. That never happened back then, but because of his success. So it was already picked up, but they were going to do the pilot, shoot that, and then take, I don't know, 2 months off and edit and tweak, and then come back and do I guess, the next 12 episodes. I had arranged, I don't even remember how this happened, but I was going to interview for the art director position. I'd never been an art director before. And there's a lot of what an assistant art director or set designer does that, or an art director does that as an assistant art director or set designer, you don't get to do. So like budgeting and scheduling, like all of that, you don't, for the most part, you're not involved in that. And I would try to look at budgets and schedules when I was working as an assistant art director, just try to understand it. But until you sit down and do it, like, you don't really know how to do it. So I thought I have no chance to get this job. And it was, as I remember, it was pretty slow in New York. So I thought, I really don't have a chance, because this guy, the designer's name is Stephen Jordan, really, really great guy. I thought Stephen's going to have a choice of pretty much anybody. And I thought, I'm going to cancel this. Like, I don't want to waste his time. I don't want to waste my time. Like, this is silly. But I waited too long. And I thought, well, I can't cancel now. It's too late. So my goal is I got to go into this interview and just present, like, try not to embarrass myself. So I went into the interview and it went really well. And he loved my background in architecture. And that show Third Watch was about New York, like outer borough, like firemen and paramedics and police. And my father was a firefighter. So I think that helped. And I left thinking, wow, I might have this job. And he hired me and I got the job, and I killed myself to get that done. It was really hard. He was a great boss, but it was a lot of work. So I was kind of learning on the job and did that. And that was my first art directing job. And I would say I art directed for about 10 years on TV and movies. Probably the two biggest movies I art directed on, I was the New York art director on the original Spider-Man movie and Spider-Man 2. And it was a similar situation where there was an opportunity that came up for a production design position on a period pilot in New York based on the French Connection movie. It was called NY-70. And it was a similar thing where I went into the interview like, I'm not going to get this job, but I'm going to put together a lookbook. And this was back when people didn't really do lookbooks so much, but I'm like, I'm going to put this together. I'm going into this. I just want to present as well as possible. I know I'm not getting the job, but I want to not embarrass myself. And I ended up getting the job. And that was my first production design job. And that led to, that show was one of those shows that everyone said, this show's picked up for sure. And it wasn't. And there was the head of NBC that was like one of his babies. I think he'd gotten fired or left and somebody new came in. That's one of those things where like the new guy doesn't really want to, shepherd or bring along the last guy's pet project. So that show never went anywhere, but some people had seen it and the right people saw it. And there was a show called Surface, an NBC show, kind of a sci-fi homage to like 70s Spielberg. And the producers from that had seen it and they were like, well, let's interview this guy. I interviewed, and that was my next job. And that was a series. And that's primarily what I've been doing since the last 18, 19 years. Production designing. There have been times where I filled in gaps as an art director. And when it made sense work-wise, and at one point, I was hired to do a show that brought me back to LA. So I moved from New York to LA, was there back in LA for about 7 years. And one of the movies I art directed on was a Peter Berg movie called Battleship. And it was something where I needed the work, but I'd worked on these big movies like Spider-Man, Spider-Man 2, and as an assistant art director, I'd worked on like the original Men in Black movie in New York. But the big sets on those movies were done in LA. So New York was used as a location primarily. We built sets in New York, but they were like cover sets. And I I really wanted Battleship was at the time, I don't know what the ultimate budget was, but initially it was like a $180 million movie. And I was like, I would like to see how this is done from the LA side with all of the concept artists and illustrators and the really big sets. So I as much as I didn't want to art direct, I was like, this is something I really want to see how this is done. And it was really great. It was amazing. Um, and that's, like I said, I've been filling in with art directing stuff. It's been a while since I've art directed. But working almost exclusively as a production designer in TV and film, mostly TV. I'd love to do more films, but I think a lot of films, what used to be films are now like limited series on Netflix or streaming services. So there's like the lower end of films in terms of budgets, like the tier movies, under 10 million, and then there are the giant movies. And the stuff in between, there's not anywhere near as much of that as there used to be. And I've done an occasional commercial and music video. Don't love commercials because I don't work in them enough to have the kind of people to call on to do that. The music videos I've done, those are some of the best times I've had as a designer. Those are great. They're hard. Usually there isn't much money, but they turn out to be a lot of fun. Yeah, that was a long answer to your initial question.
That's fine. Since our audience is novices, mostly young people, can you explain the difference between a production designer and an art director?
Certainly. It's even to some people, the nomenclature is a little confusing because the term production designer didn't exist back in the day. So many decades ago, the term art director, that was the person really designing the movie. That's probably even kind of pre-TV. And I believe it was on Gone with the Wind where the production designer, William Cameron Menzies, the director of the movie, ended up coming up with the term production designer. He said he wasn't just the art director on this; he designed the production, because he was involved in. There were a lot of what might seem simple now, but really kind of complicated special effects and composited, like the burning of Atlanta and all that. So the production designer or art director was technically his title until it became production designer, but he was involved in, the camera has to be here, it has to be, this kind of lens, and just he was figuring all of that out. So that's where that term came from. And it's something that caught on over the years, and now it's a weird thing because it's an accepted term. However, in the union pay structure, there's no separate pay line for a production designer. It's based on what the art director gets. So as a production designer, you have to get paid at least art director scale. And even, especially in the LA union, the term production designer or the title, the first time you work under that, you have to apply to be granted that title. And it's a bit of an arduous process. Once you've done it once, then they still have to go in and ask for that. But once you've done it once, it's more of like, yeah, it sort of gets approved quickly. But so the way it's structured now, as the production designer on a project is really the person designing the look of the show, designing the sets, heavily involved in scouting, looking at locations, picking the locations, modifying the locations. Almost every location on a project will need some kind of modification. Sometimes it's minor, sometimes it's could be extreme, and it really depends on the circumstances. It could be, and sometimes it's based on the schedule. Like, hey, we were going to shoot at this used car lot. and we've picked this one, we love it, and that's going to take up, 2/3 of a day. And then we've got a third of a day at a French restaurant. And there are no French restaurants right by that. So they don't want to move the whole company, all the trucks, all the people. They don't want to, if you can avoid it, because time is so crucial. If they can avoid moving the entire film company from one location to another location on the day, that's what they want to do. So we start looking at other restaurants around the area. And, maybe there's an Italian restaurant. And maybe an Italian restaurant's fine in the story, but maybe it's not. Maybe it has to be French. Like maybe there's something in the plot line, like this has to be a French restaurant. So you might find a restaurant that is close to the used car lot, and you go in, and now as the designer, you have to make this Italian restaurant look like a French restaurant. How do you do that? Or maybe it doesn't matter what kind of restaurant it is. Maybe it's a restaurant and people come in and there's a shootout, and you're building lots of things walls that are going to get shot up, and you're doing all of that. So there are a million different things that might need to be modified at a location. I love locations where we can walk in and be like, this works just like it is. That hardly ever happens. There's always something, and usually it's more than you want to have to do to make it work. And sometimes it's like a really extreme conversion of a location. Production designer, you're also working hand in hand with the director, so like location selection, it's not just what the production designer thinks, it's the director who's, got a way bigger say than the production designer. It's the cinematographer. Producers might be weighing in like, well, yeah, we don't want to move the company. Like, you guys all love this other place, but we're not moving the company. There are a lot of factors, and it could be just even the cost of a location. This location's great. The location manager says, well, they want like $50,000 for this for one day, and they're like, yeah, we're not doing that. You also work. You want to collaborate with the costume designer. You want to make sure that what the wardrobe is and the costume design works well with what the location or the set, coordinating colors and all of that. And as the production designer, as the head of the art department, somebody explained this to me once, and I think it makes sense. So if you think of the art department, it's sort of like a pyramidal structure, the production designer being at the top, and then you've got these layers below that. So you will always have an art director. You might have several art directors. So that movie I mentioned, Battleship, I was one of maybe 5 art directors. So I was the art director in charge of that was a movie with an alien invasion. So I was the art director in charge of all the alien concepts. So alien, the spaceships, anything alien related. There was another art director that dealt with all of the naval stuff, like US Navy, all the ships, all that. There was another art director who was a kind of 3D digital art director. And then we ended up adding additional art directors. So just depending on the size of the project and the complexity of it, you might have one art director, you might have a whole bunch. So the Spider-Man movies I worked on, I was the New York art director, but there were a number of art directors in LA. And then you'll have assistant art directors, set designers, graphic designers. You've got art department coordinator, you've got art assistants. As the production designer, you're also working hand in hand with the set decorator. So like when the Oscar is given for production design, it goes to the production designer and the set decorator. As much as I sometimes think, and having been on projects where I think like the art director should also be part of that, or art directors, it goes to the production designer and the set decorator. And then the set decorator, they have their whole department that's pyramidal. You're also working with, on the show, you'll have a construction coordinator, and that person's got a whole team of people building the sets. You've got a scenic department that's involved in painting the sets, aging them, making them look new or old, adding character. And I'm sure there are a whole slew of people that I'm not even thinking of. But yeah, it's a kind of pyramidal hierarchy, and the production designer now is the head person, and art directors below that, and then depending on the size of the project. So I would say, like, back when I started working in TV, our One of my, this probably my second or third art directing job. I was the art director on The Sopranos. I started season 2, and I did that for 4.5 seasons. And our art department was tiny. There was no money on that show initially. Like it wasn't, as we were working on it, it became a big cultural thing. And then there was more money and more money. But like when we started, there was the production designer, Bob Shaw, me as the art director, no set designer, no assistant art director. I mean, we'd occasionally get an assistant art director if it was really like, we're like, we can't get this done. We need an additional person. Usually no graphic designer. I was doing most of the graphics. Bob was doing some of them. Bob and I were drafting everything. And we had an art department coordinator and an art PA, and that was the art department. It's crazy. Now you'd never see that now, like not on a show of that scale or importance.
So I would imagine this is probably just dumb common sense, but the difference between working on a feature film and a TV show or series is the budget and the amount of time you get to spend on each setup, I would assume.
That's certainly part of it. But it depends. You could be on a movie that's got no money, or you could be on a movie with lots of money. I would say one of the biggest differences is just the process. So on a movie, you've got one script, and it's more of a just sort of a linear process. You've got the script, you're in pre-production, you're prepping for that. And then the scripts are always going to change as you're working on it, and then you go into production where you're shooting it, and you've got that schedule, and that schedule will change too based on, whatever weather, and, an actor gets sick or whatever. But there's sort of a beginning, middle, and end to that. And it's a linear process. Whereas in like a TV series, it's more of a kind of a controlled chaos where you're always, you come in at the beginning, you're prepping, and it depends. Like, let's say it's a straight to series order where you say it's Netflix, you're doing 10 episodes. You're probably designing and building sets right out of the gate, and what we call permanent sets. So those are sets that you're probably going to go back to throughout the course of the series. And those are the sets they're willing to spend more money on. They can, what they call, amortize the cost of that over the course of the season. And then there are what we call swing sets. That's a set that might play in 1 episode or 2 episodes. And those are usually, you're not spending as much money on those. You're, less detailed. You always want it to look good and look real. But when there's a budget for the whole show. And then if you're amortizing the cost of, let's say we're building a restaurant for the show, and you're amortizing that over the course of 10 episodes, then each additional episode's got its own budget. And for me, it's the big budget for me is what we could just say there's the construction and paint costs. So it's the build and the paint of the sets. And then the set decorator's dealing with his or her budget as well, which I sometimes have to get involved in. And anyway, I lost my train of thought on the course of the series. So you start a series, you're probably designing and building big sets, and then and it depends. Like, shows are a bit different than they used to be. You used to do kind of 1 episode at a time. Now you do, like, the last show I did was a show called Mayor of Kingstown. We shot that in Pittsburgh. It was season 3 of that show. That show shot in blocks of 2 episodes. So we would do episode 1 and 2 at once, and that'd be one director, and then another director would do the next 2. Like, I did the first season of a Showtime series that's now on Netflix called Your Honor, and that we shot in blocks of 3. So it was block of 3, a block of 3, a block of 3, and then the last episode was a single episode because it was 10 episodes. But you're going and you're prepping you might be building the big sets, like I said, and you're getting everything else ready for that 1 episode, if it's done episode to episode, or the 2 episodes or the 3 episodes. And then while those are shooting, say it's a block of 3, while that's shooting, the director for the next block comes in. So you're still getting all that ready for the first block. which is usually a massive amount of work. And then you're also prepping the next block.
Right.
And if you have scripts or even beyond that, you have to start thinking about that too. So it's, whereas a movie's just sort of linear, the TV series is like kind of everything's like piggybacking, and it's a little nuts.
So talking about scripts, I'm curious how do you approach a script? How do you break it down and come up with a mood board or sketches, or how do you conceptualize that?
I guess it depends on what part of the project it is. So often, like when I interview for a job, they might send me a script or multiple scripts, and I'll sit down and read them, and I'll take notes. And I usually do notes like, and it depends. Sometimes I'll just be like, I'll force myself, just read it, don't take any notes. It's hard for me to do, but just read it, don't take any notes, and then go back and reread it and then take notes. But what I more times than not end up doing is taking notes. And sometimes I'm just cutting and pasting from the script on the computer. Sometimes I'll handwrite it. It just sort of depends. And sometimes these scripts they'll send are like, they're protected and they won't let you copy and paste anything. So then I'm handwriting it. But if I can do it on the computer, I'll be like, okay, I grab like at the top of the scene, it'll say interior train car. So I'll cut and paste that, and then I add that. And I'm just making a list of all the different sort of sets and or locations. And I'll try to break it up if I can. Sometimes I'll know like this has to be a set. Sometimes I'm like, that's a location. If I can break it up, I will. And then I'll do additional notes. Like this needs more research, or I'll have an idea like, oh, that thing, that location, or that thing that's mentioned. I'll have a separate category, research, like look this up. And sometimes it might even be something that's mentioned in the script, like, and maybe it's something I don't know what it is. It'll say, some descriptive, well, I don't know what that is, or I don't know enough about that, like research that. And then I just have a separate section for just notes, just random stuff. So in the interview process, so I have all that, and then I go back and then I start putting together a lookbook, start researching pictures and research things based on my notes. And there's often not a lot of time from when I get the call from my agency where they want to interview you, they set up the interview, and it's only a few days, and it's like, okay, this is going to be a sprint. And,
Hit the ground. Yeah.
Yeah. And back in the day, like before the internet was really what it is now, like it was more based on book research and going to like the New York Library or I don't think it exists anymore, the Warner Brothers Library out in LA, like pulling images that way. Now it's mostly done online, or I might know like, oh, that's a really good book. I have it on I can show you. Hold on. Walk with me. So I have like just a ton of books. This is my design library, part of it.
Cool.
And this isn't even all. I've just run out of space on my shelves. But so I might just start pulling books from my own library, or I might know, oh, there's a book that I don't have that I know is a good resource. Start ordering books. So it's a combo of book research, online research, kind of anywhere I can find it. And I would say anytime I'm putting together a lookbook and just compiling photos, there's a point where I think I am not finding what I want to find. And I'm also thinking like, I'm looking at the stuff online, like everybody else that's interviewing for this is finding the same stuff. Like I don't want to show the same stuff everyone's showing. So as an example, I was up for a pilot. This is probably 12 years ago. It's an NBC pilot called the Playboy Club, and it was based on the original Playboy Club in Chicago. It was set in 1961. And it was a juicy design project. It was like very stylish, period. I really wanted the job, and I was trying to pull together images for that and finding stuff that I think everyone was probably finding. And then trying to look further afield. I lived in LA at the time, and I ended up going to the Taschen bookstore. Taschen's a publisher that does a lot of art and design books. And I was like, I think they've done something on Playboy. So I went to the one I think it's at the Farmers Market, the Grove in LA, and they had a limited edition box set, and it was in this big acrylic case, and it was beautiful. And it was kind of the history of Playboy magazine and the Playboy clubs, and the clubs were like, people that don't know the history of that. I mean, I think people might think they're more like strip clubs. They weren't. There was live music. They were very high end. It was you had to be a member. There was food. The magazine was the magazine, but the clubs were not, I mean, I think they were sexy and cool and stylish and all that, but they weren't. It's nothing debaucherous about them. So I'm trying to find research on the Playboy clubs, because there were a bunch of them. There was the original one in Chicago, and then they started opening all over the world. And also find stuff on the Playboy Mansion, which was originally in Chicago, and wasn't finding much of anything online. And I'm looking through these books in this limited edition box set. I'm like, oh, there's so much good stuff in here. But I think the price was like $1,300. I'm like, oh my God, like, do I buy this set? I'm like, this might be the difference between me getting the job and not getting the job. So I'm like, if I spend the money on it and I get the job, then it's totally worth it. If I spend the money on it and I don't get the job, then I'm an idiot. And I'm stuck with this giant box set of this that I only bought for this job that I didn't get. And it was a very sleepless night that night, because I thought I'd be awake in the middle of the night and think, okay, I'm going to buy it. I'm going to buy it. I'm going to do it. And the next moment, like, no, that's stupid. I'm not doing it. I'm not doing it. And so I ended up not buying it. And I put together a lookbook that I was very happy with without that information. As much as I would have loved some of those images in there were images in there that I hadn't seen anywhere else. Ended up getting the job. And when I met on it, they'd already met with a bunch of people. And they told me at the time, they said, you're the first person we've met with that's actually understood what we're going for. And I was like, yeah. So I got the job. I did the pilot, and then did the series. And it was one of the best, sort of juiciest design jobs I've had. The show got canceled very quickly, unfortunately. And there, I think they only aired 3 episodes. So and I think we made 8 by the time it got canceled. So a lot of the work has never been seen. But I have on my shelves, they eventually made a mini version of that box set that was like $100. So I have that. But on a show, like if I'm already on a show and working and I get a script, I'll sit down, I make a list of, I have kind of 4 categories. One of them will be existing sets, another one existing locations, based on, like, let's say we're in the middle of the season. And sometimes it's a guess. It might be like, oh, this was scripted for this. I know that's an existing set. That sounds like it's this location we already have. And then there's new sets and new locations. And that's a guess too. Like, I think we probably need to build this, but who knows? And then I'll have additional notes. And then based on, that's just for me to process it. Like for me, writing things down, I remember things better if I write it down. So I'm sure some people do that on the computer. For me, the process of writing it down, and I actually kind of it ends up being kind of a cool chart of things. And sometimes it might even have lines that connect, like here's an existing set, and then it might connect to something else, because I don't know quite sure, like, is that actually just going to be that, or we might have to add this additional piece as something else. So it ends up being kind of a cool little graph. I was actually going through some old paperwork today, and I came across some from the last show, and I was like, oh, like I don't need those anymore, but I kind of like to keep these things. And then depending on what it is, research wise, like if there's a new set on the show, I'll do research for that. So on the last show, the Mayor of Kingstown season I did, we ended up building, for instance, one of the things we ended up designing and building was the interior of a yacht. There was a kind of a Russian mobster type who had been brought in by the Russian mob to take over for someone else who things had gone wrong for that person, and he was living on a yacht, and we ended up shooting. The locations department found the biggest boat that existed in Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh is a city of rivers, so without having to, producers didn't want to spend money to bring in a big boat from elsewhere if we didn't have to. So we ended up with the biggest boat that sort of permanently resides in the Pittsburgh area. And it was something that was built in the late 60s. So it's not like the brand new, like Russian oligarch kind of yacht. It's much smaller than that. It was more vintagey. I wasn't sure that was the right direction, but the showrunner, the head writer, really liked that idea. So we ended up using that for all of the exteriors and the kind of above deck things. The interior spaces, especially below deck, were just too small to shoot in. So what we ended up doing was there were a lot of scenes with like kind of parties and more intimate scenes and meetings and things like that were going to happen below deck. And we ended up designing and building a set on stage that is supposed to be in that boat. So we use the boat for as all the exteriors and then some stuff above deck. And then whenever we were below deck in that boat, that was on stage. So that was a big research project, kind of looking for kind of anything and everything. And then for me, research is really important. Like I don't like to just try to just make it up whole cloth. Like, let's see what the real thing is. And sometimes you end up, you take artistic license, but let's see what the real thing is or what all the real things are and figure out like what do I like? And that's part of my job as a designer. Like, okay, I have to make this thing look like it's in this boat, that we're going to see this real boat, but also probably nicer than what was actually in that boat, because what was in the boat wasn't as interesting as, we can make it more interesting than the real boat. So that was a process. And I ended up having printed all of it out, had it on my walls and in my office, and ended up designing something that was, I think ended up being really cool.
A few more questions, if you don't
Hey.
mind. Go ahead.
Okay, did I turn it off? Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
So I have so many questions.
Okay.
Because I feel like you and I have practically crossed paths, but not even known it. I was on Spider-Man 2.
Okay.
So were you working with Neil Spizak on that?
Yeah. So Neil was the designer on the first one and the second one.
Second one.
So I worked with him on both of those. And then he was also the designer on Battleship, the movie I mentioned.
Okay.
And he was the designer on Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. So I also art directed on that for a bit, and then it shut down. And when it came back up, I was already designing something. So, and then also worked with Neil on the pilot episode of Ray Donovan. So I interviewed to be the designer on Ray Donovan. And that was a series where at the time it was a straight to series order. They were going to do the pilot and take a little time off and then go back and do the series. And I interviewed to be the designer, and Neil, turns out, had also interviewed, and he had a connection with one of the producers. So they ended up hiring Neil, but Neil would only do the pilot. He didn't want to do the series. So at some point it got floated because I think I was like second place of all the people they interviewed. So they wanted Neil. I was like second choice. At some point they said, do you think it would be inappropriate to approach Scott about art directing for Neil on the pilot and then taking over as the designer? And what they didn't know is that I'd art directed for Neil several times before. So that's what we ended up doing. So I was his art director on the pilot for Ray Donovan, and then I took over the series.
Got it. And then, so of course, I know Neil from Carnegie Mellon and from,
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So he's lovely, and I've worked with him on a few projects, but I'm in the costume department. But I was wondering what your experience shooting in Pittsburgh was and whether you enjoyed that, because it's an interesting city after spending time there.
Well, the show that I just did, it was my third time working there. So I did a pilot for a show called Those Who Killed. It was an American version of a think it was a Danish show. The Danish show was, I think the title was Those Who Kill, but in Danish, whatever that translates to. And it was big in Europe. So that was the American version. I did the pilot episode for that. And liked working in Pittsburgh at the time. I mean, it was a thing where I was there. I mean, a TV pilot for someone like me, a production designer, is normally maybe 8 or 9 weeks. It depends on the size of the show. But I see your dog running off. Anyway, they kept pushing the show. They were casting. It took them a really long time to cast the lead for that show, who ended up being Chloe Sevigny. So I ended up being there a lot longer than I would normally be there on a pilot, and actually had to leave right before we started shooting because I was slated to go back to Ray Donovan, the show I just mentioned. So we bumped the art director up to designer, but I really liked it. But the offices were at the William Penn Hotel, and that's where they put me up. So I spent most of my time like downtown, aside from when we were scouting and things. But I enjoyed it. And then I went back to do another project there a while later. And that project for me was not so pleasant. So then Pittsburgh had left a bad taste in my mouth. So when I was up for this last job for mayor of Kingstown, I was a little bit reticent to go back to Pittsburgh, but it ended up being so great. I loved it. I mean, Pittsburgh, like visually, is amazing. There's so much texture, and it's not overshot. It's not the kind of place that you've seen it's not like Los Angeles or New York where so many projects have been done there that like you end up seeing some of the locations and places over and over again. Like Pittsburgh's not that. Like it's so visually rich and unique and amazing. And so like the show that I just did, Mayor of Kingstown, it's set in a fictional town in Michigan called Kingstown, but it's supposed to be rough and tumble and gritty and kind of eroding. And Pittsburgh still has a lot of that. I mean, Pittsburgh's really kind of, had a rebirth. There's a lot of, it used to be the steel industry, obviously, but now it's a lot of, I think, tech and healthcare. So a lot of Pittsburgh is kind of gentrified and had a rebirth, but it still has a lot of neighborhoods and places that are really industrial and have a lot of patina on them. So it's really great for that. So it was an amazing time. And right now we think it's coming back for a 4th season. So I'm just kind of waiting. I think any day we're going to get the word that it's been picked up for a 4th season.
That's exciting. I was wondering how it is for supporting production, because it seems like an unusual place. You hear about everybody shooting in Atlanta, Oklahoma, all those in Albuquerque, but they do shooting there, but not as much.
There's a really good crew base there. I think Pittsburgh could support probably 2 good-sized projects at once. I think if you had more than that, you might start to stretch it a little thin, but like this last job, we were kind of the only thing happening. So we had the A team. But yeah, I think they could do 2 or 3 projects at once.
So sort of switching gears, but not too much. You're up for different jobs that, you want or you don't want, or you're ambivalent about. How do you deal with it just internally when you don't get the job?
I cry. I get in the fetal position on the floor. No, I don't know. It depends. Like, yeah, it's always hard not to get the job. I mean, sometimes I would say more times than not during the interview, I kind of know, like, if you've nailed it. It's a little harder when you feel like I did a really good job. Like I always think my lookbooks, by the end of the process of putting together a lookbook, I'm usually very happy with it. So I go in and it's different. Like back in the day, you'd go in person. Now with Zoom and everything, it's hardly ever, if ever, in person. It might be different on a movie where you might just go in and meet with just the director, but on a TV show where you've got I'd be meeting with probably the showrunner and the line producer and probably another producer or 2. It almost always now going to be via Zoom. So I used to I think I was better, I presented better in the room with people. It took some time to get used to doing kind of the virtual thing. Now I think it's fine because it's just so ubiquitous. But there have been times where I'm in the interview, which is now via Zoom most of the time, and I think this is going really well, but I don't feel like, yes, for sure I got it. And in those moments, I think I end up like, those are the times I end up not getting the job. And there's the occasional one where it goes really not great. It's like I've had a couple of those like, oh my God, this is awful. And I remember one years back, it was I'm not going to name the project or the director, but it was what was pre-Zoom, like Skype. So this must have been a Skype meeting. It was just me and the guy that was directing the pilot for this TV show that was going to shoot in Detroit. And I just think this was his nature. He just had he didn't react to anything and had like no emotion. And I remember, it was just hard to deal with it. You're like you're going through, trying to go through the lookbook and talk about concepts and ideas, and you're getting nothing back. And I remember thinking, man, you might need to check this guy for a pulse. Anyway, I didn't get that job, so I don't know. I just think that's kind of how that guy was. But I also didn't get the job. There was another interview I had with a big producer, not going to name her name, and this was, I don't know, 3 or 4 years ago, and that went so poorly that I was like really kind of bothered by it. Like the first one I mentioned with the guy who wasn't reacting, it was just sort of like, I think this is who this is. I don't think I got the job, and I didn't. This one I just mentioned, she'd asked me a question at one point, and I was like, oh man, this is a loaded question, and I don't know how to answer this. And I thought she was asking something that maybe, and perhaps in retrospect, I misunderstood where she was going with it. And I thought I'd answered it. I thought she was unhappy with my answer. And then I started trying to like dig myself out of the hole, which was really just digging the hole deeper. And that was a rough one. And I was on the phone with my agent right after that and was trying to explain what happened. He's like, yeah, she's a tough one. And anyway, so how do I deal with it? It depends. It's, you always want to be the one that they want to hire. And it also depends on like, do I have other options at the time? The industry's been quite slow lately. I mean, there was COVID, there was the strikes last year. So there was a time kind of before all that where it was so busy that like, if you didn't get one job, you were going to be on something else pretty quickly. And that's not the case anymore. So now it's, I guess it depends on how much I want the job, how much I'm looking forward to it, how long I've been out of work, like how juicy the job was design wise, or like, oh, is this like, a director or producer I really want to work with? Or, sometimes it might be like, well, sometimes I get scripts for things. I mean, I've gotten scripts for things for my agency, and I'm like, I read it and then I'm like, this is terrible. I don't want to work on this. And there are other times where it's like, yeah, it's all right. I'll take a meeting on it. And, if you don't get one of those, it's less hurts your feelings less. I mean, I don't want to say it hurts your feelings, but like, it really just depends on how much you want the job and what, and there are a lot of reasons that might weigh into why you want a specific job. But it's part of the business. Like, you're not going to get every job, and I usually don't know who I'm up against or how many people that are interviewing. I will tell you, I had an interview a couple of years back. It was for a job that I was not design-wise not interesting at all, but I really wanted that job because it was going to shoot in New Orleans. I wanted to be in New Orleans at the time, and I needed the work. And there wasn't much happening. So I was like, I really wanted it for those reasons. So maybe wanted it for not all the right reasons, but I wanted it. And there's a producer involved that I'd worked with on Sopranos. He's the one that reached out to me initially just to pick my brain about some other people. And he's like, well, would you be interested in this? I was like, yes. So I interviewed for it. I thought the interview went fine. I ended up not getting the job. And they ended up interviewing. I heard later that the group of people, I would say normally they probably interview like production designers, maybe 3, 4, 5 people. Like they're not going to interview a ton, but they want to have a selection. So that first group of people, they didn't hire anyone from that first group. I was in that first group. So then they started looking for more people. Anyway, when I eventually heard back, like, yeah, I didn't make the cut. This producer I knew said, but at this point I think he said like, we've got 5 really good candidates or 4 really good candidates. And I was like, wow, I didn't even make the top 4 or 5. I'm like, ouch. That one hurt my feelings. I'm like, so, it just depends on the job and the people and how bad you want it.
So of all the production designers you've met and worked with or know about, is there like a series of common traits that they have that make them ideally suited to be a production designer? Like if a student had some of these talents, would they be a good fit to work towards that?
I think to do well in this business, I think you need to be a creative thinker. I think you also need the ability to kind of manage a department. So having that, which is not something, at least initially, it wasn't really I was more interested in just the design and the artistic end of it, but you have to be able to manage a department and people. And part of that is just even hiring the right people. So like a lot of the management of the department is handled by the art directors, or art directors. So like I like to hire the right art director or art directors and let them do that and not get involved in, sort of all the scheduling and, all that day-to-day stuff. And, sometimes some things will go sideways and then I'd have to step in. And anyway, it's not my favorite part of the job, but it is something you have to do. You also have to, as a production designer, you're collaborating with the director and the producers, cinematographer. So like that's a skill that you're either maybe innately good at or you have to learn. And the designer on The Sopranos, Bob Shaw, who, if I had to say someone was my mentor, I would say Bob is my mentor. So I worked with him on Sopranos for a long time and some other projects. He said one of the best skills in this business, one of the most important skills, is to be able to be in a room with a person or people that you can't stand and pretend like you like them, which is absolutely true. So, because there are times, I mean, there are a lot of jerks in this business. So, and like navigating that is, that's a real skill. And there are times where it's really hard to be able to do that well. So I wish that weren't the case, but it is. And Lynette can attest to that on the show we worked on together.
Notice I'm on mute.
Yeah, so yeah, and I would say like on the last show, the Pittsburgh thing, just an aside on that, that when that opportunity came to me, they'd already done 2 seasons of it. They did the first season in Canada, in Toronto, and around there. And then the season 2 was in Pittsburgh. And the designer that had done season 2, they really liked his work, but he had some family issues he was dealing with. So I was contacted by the line producer who I'd worked with before, and he said, would you be interested in this? And I would say normally I wouldn't consider doing a season 3 of a show, because as the designer, you like to go in and establish the look of the show. You don't want to take over somebody else's work and just sort of carry that on. But this was right after the strikes. So this started for me the end of 2023. So I hadn't worked in almost a year, which is crazy. Like I kind of work nonstop if I can. So he said, would you consider doing this show as a season 3? I was just like, yes, absolutely. And there were times on that show, I think on any show where like, these shows, it's long hours. It can be very stressful. I would say in the sort of darkest moments on that show, or just the moments where I was like, oh, this is a rough day or whatever, I would tell myself, well, I'm happy to be working. And all of these people are nice, because that's not always the case. I was like, oh, all these people are lovely. So being able to work on a show where you really like everyone and everyone's nice to each other, that was great. And I think I might have mentioned it earlier, season 1 of Your Honor in New Orleans a few years ago. And that was another show where everyone was just really lovely. And I'd come off of a couple of shows where that wasn't the case. So being able to manage personalities or work around personalities that aren't so pleasant is a real skill in the business. I also think to work in this, you have to be willing to work really hard and work long hours and pay your dues. Like I think I certainly paid my dues over the decades, working my way up the ladder and working jobs that were just really arduous. And I mean, that's me. I mean, I know when it was really busy a few years ago, there were people that were getting pushed up the ladder really quickly, and probably too quickly. But it depends on the situation and the jobs and the market. But I think having a good work ethic and being willing to work really hard and put in the hours is really important. And you should be passionate about it. Like, it's, the job's not always fun. There are parts of it that are fun. There are parts of it that are not fun. And being able to just do it all. And I would say at the end of the day, like, what I really love as a designer is when I've designed a set and it all sort of gels. Like, I sit down with my background in architecture, and this isn't the case with every designer. Some designers come out of different fields and maybe don't even really know how to sit down and like do a floor plan. So I would say the best designers can do it all. They could lay out a set, they could do 3D illustrations of everything, they can manage the department. Like, there's so many different aspects. So like, I would say one of my weaknesses would be sitting down and doing a 3D illustration of a space. I can do it. It'd take me a really long time, and it's not going to be anywhere near as good as if we hired an illustrator or concept artist to do it. But I can sit down and lay out a set, and I think I have a really good eye. And I think at the end of the day, the finished product is going to look really good. But there's always a point where, like, trying to lay out a set or a floor plan, where you're trying lots of different things, and it's at a certain point, I feel like sometimes I'm like, I might be struggling with it. Like, this isn't quite working. This could be fine, but I'm not happy with it. And then keep pushing, and they get to the point where, like, oh, I got it. This is it. I love that feeling where it's like, I figured it out. This is it. And then once it's all done, like, then it's a whole process of, getting it through the budget process and then building it and trying to get it done in time. And there's all that. But then once it's done and you're happy with it, like, that's another thing. It's like, this looks friggin' awesome. I love this. There are other times where you're like, I would have done this differently. Now that I see it, like, I wish I'd done this differently. So, it's the thing. And then there's at the end, when it's all done and you sit down in a movie theater and see the movie, or you're watching it on the TV and you're like, then you see the product and then it's like, oh, this is cool. Or you're at the, like, cast and crew screening or whatever. And then it's like, all this work, all these dozens and dozens of people over all these months and all this money spent. And then you're seeing the finished product. And especially if it's good, then you're like, wow, this is cool. This is why we do all this.
I'm going to ask one more question that'll probably go back in time a little bit, because what you just said was a good wrap for the whole interview.
Okay.
But I'm wondering how you and other people go about finding an agent to help you get the work.
I can only speak for myself in terms of finding an agent. So I think I'd mentioned earlier in this that my first production design job was on a pilot called NY70. So that came to me through the line producer on that. I guess they'd already interviewed a number of people and they weren't thrilled with any of the people that they'd met with. And I think part of it was, because it was this period show set in 1970 New York, they were interviewing a lot of kind of bigger designers in New York. And I think those people were coming into the interview and probably, I'm sure they could have designed an amazing looking show, but I think they were coming in kind of big. Like, I need this huge department to do this. I need this huge department. It's going to cost, $1 gazillion, whatever it is. So they were looking for, I heard this later, that the line producer had gone to a set decorator that he knew and said, here's a project we have. I'm looking for someone young and hungry that can do this, do a lean version of this, like, make it all happen. Like, it's going to kill themselves to get this done. And it isn't going to require a massive department. And the set decorator he'd gone to was a woman named Janet Shaw. She was the decorator on Sopranos. So she said, oh, she mentioned me. She said, you should talk to Scott. He hasn't production designed before, but he's been the art director on Sopranos for years. And he would be good for this, I think. So that's how I got the interview and then got the job. So that happened without an agent. And then the next job was the NBC series Surface. And that came to me because someone had seen the pilot for the NY70. And that's how I got the interview for that. So while I was working on that, agents started reaching out to me. So I think agents aren't so keen to just bring on a client that doesn't have work. But if you're already working and you have something going on, then and you have no representation, then they're like, oh, hey. So while I was on that, I had 2 different agents had reached out to me. And as that show was nearing its end, I thought, well, this would be a good time to get representation. So I met with both of them, and then I picked one of them. And then I was with that agency for a long time. And I bounced around agencies since then. And I think, once you're established, then it's easier to find an agent. But I think initially, like, you have to have some, you have to have a bit of a portfolio, and it's good if you are working on something and they want somebody they think they're going to be able to get jobs for.
They got to eat too.
Yes. Like, what they don't want is a client they can't place on a job or get any interest, or they call it, my agents always say, traction. I'm trying to get you traction on this. So if they can't get traction for their client or a potential client, you're going to be less interested in bringing on a new person.
Well, Scott, this has been fantastic.
It was fun.
Wealth of information, and I know I've learned a lot, and hopefully the people that
we laughed, we cried.
No, I learned how to use traction in a sentence different from a vehicle. So yeah.